Welcome to the Alexander Studies Online, and I'm Leslie Glover. I'm one of the team at Alexander Studies Online, and I'm delighted to welcome Brigitta Mowat. And we're going to be talking as part of the series on having two different professional strands, so Alexander technique and, in this case, psychotherapy. I wonder, Brigitta, if I could invite you to introduce yourself.
Thank you, Leslie, and thank you for inviting me for this series. It's been really interesting to think around that. And so I'm Brigitta Mowat. I first trained as an Alexander teacher between 1985 and 88, but in 1999, I became interested in training in psychotherapy, which led me to this piece of research that I published in 2004 in the Alexander Journal. Currently, I'm practicing both. I would say I'm practicing more as a psychotherapist, and the Alexander technique has moved more into the background, but I still feel incredibly grateful for what I've learned through the Alexander technique, and perhaps in the conversation that we're having, it'll come out more.
Thank you. Well, I suppose in a broad sense, I'm curious about how you see the interconnection between Alexander technique and psychotherapy, but also how the Alexander technique is still there, even though it's moved a little into the background. And I realised that before I even ask you that, I should probably ask you a little bit about the kind of psychotherapy you practice.
Right. I trained in what we integrative psychotherapy in 1998. And at that time, integration was quite a novel project, and it took theories from three main schools of psychotherapy: the psychoanalytic psychodynamic, the humanistic existential, and the cognitive behavioral. And they sort of developed alongside each other. And interesting, they also developed because the psychoanalytic that started in the late 19th century really didn't address everybody's problems. And so different ideas emerged out of perhaps identifying shortcomings of the psychoanalytic approach. Of course, I realized that more than 20 years ago that I trained, and the training has really evolved into becoming much more broad in terms of accessibility and in terms of addressing social problems that emerged, and the sort of awareness of social problems. So inclusivity and diversity runs alongside the theoretical basis.
And I'm interested because there's an interesting mix of approaches in that integrative approach that might have different theoretical that do have different theoretical backgrounds. So in a way, adding Alexander in is another part of the integration, maybe.
Indeed, integration, yes. Because I was so influenced by my Alexander technique training. I trained with Walter and Dilys Carrington, the late 80s. And I must say, at that time, the Alexander technique was thriving. I was really intrigued by the gentleness of the Alexander technique and the sort of two guiding principles: inhibition and direction. Out of inhibition, the stillness and the sort of contemplative qualities that inhibition embodies, comes a direction finding a direction for life, finding a direction for where to go, what to do. So the inhibition and direction in that order still really deeply embodied in my core and in my thinking. And it's, I guess, the Alexander technique, as it has more moved professionally more into the background, it is literally at the back of my mind. There's an application of inhibition and direction in a psychotherapeutic context I find fascinating and very effective.
Could you say more about that?
It's effective in the sense inhibition is a meditative place. It's a place of finding stillness and feeling our bodies, becoming more aware of sensations and emotions in the body. And I think inhibition allows us to get to a place of being open to receive something, whether that's the hands of an Alexander teacher or if I sit in the chair of the therapist, it helps me to bodily be receptive or be receptive in a psychophysical way, to be open to hearing and receiving people. And that in itself is a therapeutic element, because it's often what clients haven't had in their lives.
That's wonderful. And that sense of having maybe another way of hearing, another way of listening, because you're working from that place of inhibition, that place of stillness, and that training to be receptive to non-verbal, I suppose, as well as verbal information. And I wonder as well whether there is something for the clients that you see in their experience of being with you in that quiet Alexander way of being.
Well, funny you should mention that. Feedback I get from my students that I teach at the Minster Centre is that you're so calm. And I think, when I receive that feedback, I think, well, it's because I'm really inhibiting. And I guess the way that I understand inhibition is not to close down or to suppress. And I think there's always been a bit of a tension with that term, because in psychotherapy, inhibition is not really desirable, because inhibition would suggest a sense of shutting down or stopping a psychophysical response or an emotional response.
Whereas, yes, in Alexander technique, it's more about staying back, quietening and being receptive.
Yeah, but I think there has been a misunderstanding in the psychotherapy world of that term inhibition.
Which is unfortunate, I guess.
Yes, it is unfortunate, but I also think there is a history attached to it. So if I think back of my Alexander teacher training, the most part was just amazing. But whilst I really enjoyed that sort of hand contact and the stillness, I also felt that there was a sort of sometimes a disconnect between what was happening for me as a student of the Alexander technique, working with a teacher, receiving hands-on work, and what was happening in myself. So there was a sort of a lack of attending to what was happening for me in an emotional way. I think the attention was more focused on freeing and whether my body was freeing and opening and releasing. But then you get to a point where perhaps the muscular release also released memories I remember occasions when I would just burst into tears, and I didn't even know why, but there was sort of almost like a non-attendance, and ignoring of what was happening. And because there was a perception that doesn't fall within the remit of the Alexander technique, is to open up a conversation about what's happening, talking about the process. And then really this led me into psychotherapy, because I got to a point where I was so kind of, so many memories and so many emotions were released, and I kind of needed a space to process what we would call now traumatic experiences.
And I guess it makes sense that bodies do what they can. Well, our whole selves do what they can to help us through whatever situation is happening. And if part of that holding is holding on to keep functioning because of things that have happened emotionally, then inviting that to let go comes with a lot of other things. And what I'm hearing is that the Alexander kind of approach was very much about movement, about posture, about releasing muscular tension, but without acknowledging the emotional elements of that. And so when you trained in psychotherapy, how did that inform your Alexander work?
Oh, enormously. Psychotherapy is skills based and theory based. So I was really fascinated to read about the trauma theories and theories of, it's very much influenced by Wilhelm Reich, his work, where the body and body tension patterns are very central. So in some ways there are overlaps between Reichian work and the Alexander work, because both in different ways aim to release patterns, to free the emotions. But going back to thinking about the skills, how to listen, how to respond, how to explore. So, how can I ask questions that feel non-invasive, that help to come to some kind of understanding? So I would say listening skills were really fundamental in my psychotherapy training, which I then used, when I gave Alexander lessons. So eventually it became a hybrid between the Alexander technique and psychotherapy. I guess I started it when I was qualified, after qualifying as a psychotherapist in 2006. I felt kind of more confident to offer a hybrid version. So when something came up as a result of the Alexander work, and that's often in the semi-supine work, in the lying down work, that things come up for people, memories are released, that I would just pause and offer a space to talk. Where does this take you? This feeling of anger or grief or sadness. What is coming up for you? So that's just an example of integrating that word again, integrating psychotherapeutic skills to the Alexander technique. It never became psychotherapy. My hybrid version of Alexander technique never became psychotherapy. It sort of stayed in the Alexander technique camp, if you like, rather than becoming a psychotherapeutic journey.
And what would have been different if you had gone beyond the listening? Because it sounds like it is about listening and giving space. So what would you have been doing if you had been doing psychotherapy? If you see what I mean, to try and identify that contrast.
Yeah, that's a lovely question. the fundamental difference between the Alexander technique and the psychotherapy is that the role is different. So as a psychotherapist, I have the mandate to really explore trauma or psychological issues, starting with taking a history, which we don't do in the Alexander technique. We just welcome the pupil and we introduce the work. But in psychotherapy, you take a history and you work with that history. And so the focus becomes much more on the relationship, on past relationships that the client experience, but also what on the relational dynamics between the therapist and the client, because we have this wonderful concept of projection. What does the client project? And I actually think that this projection also happens between the Alexander teacher and the pupil, but it's not talked about.
And you've talked in your research that came up, that the relationship between teacher and pupil as being very important.
Yes, it is. I guess the word that comes to mind is vulnerability. The pupil actually, especially in the lying down work, quickly gets to a place of vulnerability. And the remit is very clear. I want you to release. I want you to let go, particularly with them, holding the head.
And being exposed. The front you are very exposed.
I'm being touched.
Yes.
Being touched. Yes. I actually have a lovely extract I'd like to read.
Please.
From my research, if I may.
Please.
And it was about the teacher-pupil relationship in relation to touch. And so I said the psychological dimension of physical proximity and hand contact is another under-researched topic in the Alexander technique. There are few references discussing this in the available Alexander technique literature, for example, Rubenfeld and Marrow. This is in stark contrast to counselling and psychotherapy, where the topic has been extensively researched. So my research participants, there were 12, had been studying the counselling psychotherapy for a minimum of 2 years. And they were Alexander teachers. And so participants talked about the handling of intimacy and pupils' expressions of vulnerability, of dependency. So one participant said, the lying down bit has to be regressional. Babies lie down and they can't stand. I keep realizing what a journey we are going through together on each time. And another participant said, I take up people's heads. On the table, I say, I want you to let me have your head, and the fact that they are giving up control. Frequently think myself, I wonder, when was the last time you did this? I guess we are back to when we were 3 months old. Whenever a baby develops its own neck muscles, going a long way back, and I think touch is taking us into that place. So both teachers observed that the physical work in an Alexander lesson could lead the pupil into a regressed state and evoke developmental issues. They felt that the physical movement in an Alexander lesson, when accompanied by the pupil's muscular releases, needed to be met by the reassurance of the teacher. This can be communicated through sensitive hand contact and the therapeutic relationship. Surrendering habitual control can be, as one teacher put it, a frightening experience for a pupil. So I sort of thought this extract was really fitting what we were talking about, where psychological awareness of developmental issues would be really would enhance an Alexander lesson. I know that there is, in an Alexander training, we look at developmental movements. You know, we do crawling, and these are regressive movements, but we're not really asking, what does this bring up? What does this evoke in you?
Yeah.
What is coming up for you? What was your experience of crawling? Did you crawl? You know, it's just as you mentioned earlier, it's taught within the remit of teaching free movement, but not the psychology that is attached.
And I guess
that.
One of the things is that I wonder if Alexander teachers are concerned about, if they do explore and ask those questions, what they might get in response, and how they might then manage that. And I wonder if that's some of the reticence.
Indeed. I think that was reticence, and I think it explained why my research was received in a sort of lukewarm way, and perhaps it posed a threat. But my idea really with the research was to say, look, we are training teachers on a daily basis. In contrast to psychotherapy, it takes longer, but it is on 1 day a week. And there could be space made to just talk about psychological aspects of hand contact and of teaching. There would be space to teach basic listening skills, like mirroring back, summarizing, just listening exercises.
And actually, being heard is such an incredibly powerful experience for people who maybe haven't been heard, or even if they have been heard, so something coming up. And I think sometimes there's a worry that it will lead on and on and on. And yet, if you meet someone at a bus stop and they're looking upset, you would listen, possibly.
Yeah.
It's a kind of human response that doesn't need to lead anywhere other than hearing.
Yes, absolutely. I think that, as outlined in my research, it would really enhance the Alexander technique without turning it into psychotherapy, but kind of nurturing and understanding therapeutic elements, and that people will have responses.
So if I said to you as an Alexander teacher, something's come up and I've asked them, what do I do now? What would you say? Or what happens if they keep talking? I'm not sure what the worries are, but what would you say in order to sort of help someone feel okay and know what they can and can't do? I suppose there's something there.
And so one of the things that I felt would be important is to introduce supervision to Alexander teachers. To have supervision groups, or to talk about pupils with an experienced Alexander teacher who's also trained as a psychotherapist, of which there are quite many, I would imagine.
I think when you did your research, there were quite a lot, if I remember.
And probably that number has risen. It's just really adding elements to the training, a little bit shifting the focus between freeing movements and personal process, making links, because understanding the source of a problem, or the source of stress patterns. That was in my case really what led me to Alexander technique. Is that sense of, I'm feeling stressed. How come? That's not just life. That's also to do with the context in which I grew up in, and just to understand the sources of these psychophysical patterns. Because why would we use psycho if we just really are concerned with the physical? So what it, just to teach something about the psychology of what it means to be human and development. And I would even go as far as teaching something about trauma. I mean, Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score, is now on so many people's bookshelves. It's become a popular book.
And I think some courses and a lot of teachers now do have a trauma-informed kind of approach.
That's really good to hear.
That's my sense.
I remember sort of going into Alexander trainings and just giving talks. And I remember once I presented a paper at the Alexander Congress in Lugano about touch. That was sort of an attempt to get the Alexander community to think about the psychological.
And what it means to be touched. I think as Alexander teaches, we become very used to giving and receiving touch. And it can sometimes, because of that, it's maybe easy to lose track of what it might mean for some people and how they might feel about that.
Absolutely. It's actually such a big thing. As this research participant so well articulated, that sort of holding the head, that's really what a caregiver, what a mother does to her baby before, and until such time that the baby can hold the head by themselves.
I feel like we've covered quite a lot of ground of the crossovers, the differences, how each can enhance the other, actually, of the two disciplines. I wonder if there's anything you wanted to say that I haven't asked you about or you wanted to add?
I must say I was really, really pleased to be asked, and I'm grateful for that. And because to be honest, I think I was a bit disheartened when after all this work, and then in those days, I remember analysing. It took me a whole year.
It's a huge piece of work. Yeah.
Analyse 12 interviews, and they were often more than an hour long. And in those days, you didn't have software.
No.
I remember spending whole weekends typing up an hour long to you, and then to sort of analyze it was like another couple of months. And I must say, it's interesting that it's taken 20 years for someone to sort of dig it out again, and I sort of feel like it's validated.
Well, hopefully it's bringing it a bit more into the light, and certainly I remember reading it years ago now when I started out wanting to look at emotions and the psychological aspects of Alexander work, and it was one of the only things I found, I think, at that point. So I think it's a really, really useful contribution. So thank you for that, and thank you for joining me today for this conversation. I think there's an awful lot in it, and it's been really useful. So thank you.
Thank you, Leslie.